Hello, folks. We're recording for March 27th, the fourth Sunday in the season of Lent in the year 2022. And our theme for this week in the Lent of Things has to do with shoes. Shoes. And so we begin with this scripture reading from the book of Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." And then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. We continue our passage through the Lent of Things this week by bringing shoes. We, on Sunday morning, will bring the gifts of, new or slightly worn shoes, and we'll give these away with no idea of whose feet will be wearing them. Only God knows that, which is as it should be. We always entrust our gifts to God, who takes them and turns them into grace. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be in a position to offer such gifts to others. Now, the point of the Lent of Things isn't just to bring things to church and give them away. We also spend a bit of time pondering how the very things that we bring are more than what they are. I mean, they are what they are, but they point us to God's active presence in the world. Bread, the bread of life. We see the inconsequentially small made incomprehensibly big. The cross, what we meant for evil, God turned to good. The coins, God's economy, is upside down from ours. And today, or this weekend, shoes. More precisely, I'd say the taking off of shoes. I guess on the one hand, we might think that giving people shoes will help protect their feet. And that's true, they will. But you tell me, when it comes to shoes, what's your favorite part of the day? Is it when you put your shoes on in the morning? Meh, not so much for me. Probably don't even give it a first thought, to say nothing of a second. Throughout the day, do you think of your shoes? Probably don't think of them much at all, unless you get a rock in one of them, or they're the wrong size, in which case you could get a blister or whatever, kind of a pain in the foot. When it comes to shoes, what is your favorite part of the day? That's when you take them off, right? As we say in my family sometimes, let your feet be free. But I'm going to steer this into a little bit more serious conversation, don't you? So here we go. So Moses was told to take his shoes off. Well, okay, maybe it was his sandals, but close enough. "You are standing on holy ground." Holy ground, different, awesome, special. Not because the soil had unique agronomic characteristics or because it had been blessed by the prayers of generations of shepherds. It was holy ground because God was there. Now, it was a common ancient Near Eastern custom to take off your shoes when you enter a holy place. In many cultures, that custom continues today. You take off your shoes when you're entering consecrated ground. A temple, a shrine, a gathering place that is different. It's different from, say, the mall or the workplace or the sidewalk. It's certainly not the same as that spot in front of the dumpster. That's not a custom that we especially practice. I mean, we don't ask people to take off their shoes when they come into church, and maybe you're grateful for that. But think about it. How do you physically recognize the presence of the holiness of God? We don't genuflect when we walk into our pews. We don't cross ourselves. We don't wear yarmulkes. It's all well and good. But then how do we practice reverence? Reverence, the art of recognizing that this world is full of grand mysteries that we did not make and that we can barely imagine. I offer to you not genuflection or yarmulke or crossing yourself, but I offer you that moment when you return home and take off your shoes. Whether or not it's your family's custom to take your shoes off at the door or some other custom, at some point you will take your shoes. I hope you don't sleep with your shoes on, do you? Some do, I guess. You'll be tempted to give that moment when you take off your shoes, tempted to give it no thought. It's just something you do after you've done that thing you just did and before you do the next thing that you're going to do. But I'm asking you next time you take your shoes off, the moment after you take them off, just stop. Stop right there and consider where you're standing. If you're standing on a porch full of plants, consider that these plants that you didn't make and that God is giving them growth. If you're standing at the foot of a bed, think of whoever made the bedspread, or think of the millennia of plants that died and were compressed and after thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of years turned into petroleum that was mined by someone and made into some polyester fluff that fills your pillows. Wow, there's more going on than you think. If you're kicking your shoes into a closet, ponder the lives of those bearers of God's image who made your shirts or pants or dresses or whatever you've got hanging there, and give thanks for them. Take your shoes off and recognize the holiness of God. Now, in a few weeks, when the good earth underfoot gets a bit warmer, go outside and take your shoes off. Let your feet feel from the ground up. Let your feet feel the presence of God. You know, there are several places in the Bible that say no one has seen God face to face, and even in today's reading, it said Moses didn't want to look at God. But that doesn't mean that people don't have an intimate connection to the Almighty. Adam and Eve felt it first, and they felt it through their feet. How could it have been any other way? After all, the story says the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground. Dust to dust, you know that drill. What it means, though, is that aside from the fact that we're all heading back to dust someday, is that if we want to get really close to God, to feel God's presence in our bodies, it's not so much that we come to church or sit in a rocker or say a special prayer. If we want to come especially close to God, we take off our feet. We don't take off our feet. We take off our shoes. That'd be a trick, wouldn't it? We take off our shoes and put them in the dirt. We go back to the garden. We touch the soil that God has touched. I know that's upside down from the way we usually imagine things. We usually think God is up there or out there or something like that. But we also say, don't we, one is nearer God's heart in a garden than any place else on earth. So if you want to refresh your sense of God's presence, find a patch of clean enough soil, take your shoes off and squish your feet in. Do it on the beach if that's handier for you. Mud is marvelous if you trust it. Your feet won't lie to you. They will tell you, this is holy ground, because God made it. God is present. You can feel it in your phalanges. Take off your shoes, and with your feet, behold the holiness of God, behold the presence of God, and here's a third thing. Behold the providence of God. You can Google it if you want to. Walking barefoot helps with your blood pressure. It boosts your immune system, reduces insomnia. It can improve joint health, push back against inflammation, support better posture. I'm no shill for the American Podiatric Association, if there is such a thing, or if that's how you say it. These are commonly known and well-studied benefits of taking your shoes off and walking barefoot. It's even better if you're in a clean enough place, lawn or whatever, and you can walk barefoot somewhere out on grass. But even if you're walking barefoot in your house, that has benefit. The point is that down at your feet, at a place where you wouldn't expect it, God has provided mechanisms that help provide you with what you need for good health. Now, who would have thought that? Who would have thought that these clunky creatures at the ends of our legs, these sometimes smelly things, these dogs that howl at the end of a long day, who would have thought that our feet would point us the way to the way that God is providing for us, far beyond what we usually imagine? We wouldn't think it. And then that's kind of the point, isn't it? When we lose touch with what our feet tell us, or, okay, for that matter, what our fingers or our hair or our guts or our joints tell us, we lose touch with God's careful provision. So stop when you take off your shoes. You're probably not going to smell roses, but you may get a whiff of God's providence. And with God's providence comes the tenderness of God's love. You may know that in Jesus' day, people generally wore sandals more than they wore shoes. You may know that when they gathered for a meal, they didn't so much sit at a table as they reclined, so their dirty feet were a good deal closer to the tabletop than ours ever get. You may know that it was routine for household slaves to go around the table and wash everyone's feet before dinner. It was an ordinary act of physical hygiene. But this act, the foot washing, this, according to the Gospel of John, this is the sign of God having loved his own, loved them to the very end. This is God's love. This foot washing is God's love, just as much as feeding the 5,000. Yes, even as much as dying on the cross or celebrating the gift of the widow. This ministry to the feet of his friends, this is the tenderness of God's love. It is in its own way a sacrament, just as truly as a means of God's grace as baptism or the Lord's Supper. Jesus said, I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Now, I've never been able to get a grown-up to allow me to wash their feet. Kids don't mind so much. Kids don't mind. I'm not sure what it is about us as we age. Sure, our feet might get scrawnier or fatter, or our toenails might get scraggly, or the polish might have chipped off of them, or our skin might be cracked, or whatever. But most of us hide our feet from one another. You don't need to, you know. You don't need to hide your feet. Next time you take your shoes off, if you take the time to really look at your feet, you may see the hands of Jesus pouring water over them, massaging them, drying them, loving you in the process. Now, I'll grant that you'll likely have to squint just so, or catch the perfect ray of light to see it. But if you can imagine your feet as those extraordinarily beautiful extremities that are fit to carry the sweet wine and honey of the good news of Jesus Christ, well then, you know you're standing on holy ground, right? You probably never thought that your feet would take you there, did you? You never knew that if you took the time to turn aside from the ordinary humdrum of life, that if you took the time to turn aside, your feet could respond to the holiness of God with reverence, that they could feel the presence of God and there find comfort, that your feet would sense the providence of God and teach you gratitude, or that your feet would witness the tenderness of God's love and fill you with delight. But your feet, listen, your feet, they are among the wonderful things God has given you, that you might not just live by the Spirit, but walk by the Spirit. That's our word for this week. I hope you appreciate your feet just a little bit more. I know that if you've ever had the use of your feet taken away from you for a while, you certainly do appreciate them a ton, right? Well, God bless you. We'll see you next week around this time after we have done another bit of reflection. Next week's gift is oil. So we'll consider, in our Lent of things, we'll consider the gift of oil and what that means. God bless. I'll see you next week.